Our guest speaker today is Tamera Kohler, the CEO for the Regional Task Force on Homelessness. She's been in that role since 2018, but has spent many years serving state and local governments and nonprofits on key issues like poverty and homelessness, and affordable housing. And she served in Seattle, and also Utah. And those are two locations that have had some successes that we have seemed to have avoided in San Diego so far. But she's been very involved in those areas as well. So I think without further ado, Tamara, I'm going to hand it over to you. And do you have a slide presentation?
I don't today. I thought it might be better to let's have a conversation today, which I think will be great. And then I'll send you some references you guys can look at later.
Perfect. Then I'm going to stop the share so that people can see you and you can see us.
Well, thank you, Wendy, and thank you for the invitation. And I loved your music to start a meeting with. I'm gonna steal that. I do a lot of meetings, and for a Saturday, I'm really honored to join you. As Wendy said, I have a background in, actually, this is my second career, is to address homelessness. And I did this work at the state of Utah. I've done it for the city of Seattle and here in San Diego now for about 6.5 years. And it is the top social issue that we're all talking about. And as many of us in this work know, it is, and at one time was a really not a partisan issue, it was a partnership issue, and now it's become rather partisan. And so a lot of the conversations that we talk about today is really level setting some of the terminology and practices. So I was asked to talk about housing first, and I want it to be a dialogue as well. So I'm going to just jump right in on housing first and the importance of it. I'll also just say that housing first is a policy and it's a practice. And the policy really started in the Bush administration. So it really wasn't a partisan issue. It was really around a housing issue and addressing homelessness. And it is a well-researched policy and practice. But I'm going to give you the real basics about it because I think the discussions today around housing first are really not rooted in the simplicity of what it is as a practice and is used in language to say that many of the things that we're doing to really address someone's homelessness is not working because we are continuing to see more people experiencing homelessness and therefore housing first doesn't work. So housing first as a practice really has 5 core principles. And I'll just start at the Regional Task Force. We also start with what we believe, and I'll start with those because it leads into housing first. I know with this work that homelessness is a global issue. I also know that all people, and our data shows that all people are successful in housing if they have the right supports and opportunity. Whether you've ever experienced homelessness or not, we're all successful in our own housing because we have the right supports and opportunities. That housing is a basic need and right, and that homelessness really is an experience, it's not a label. And we need to talk about the experience of homelessness in what are the solutions and how we address it, not about homelessness as a group of people, because it is a really unique individual experience, and that all people deserve compassion and respect and really to be treated with dignity. Housing first as a principle is really rooted in one thing that I talked about, that all people are successful in housing with the right supports and opportunity. Housing first as a practice is the principle that we want access to housing. It really is based around immediate access to housing without someone being ready for housing. And that's somewhere where the housing first practice and principle really struggles in communities, especially in the East Coast, where we have limited housing stock and supply. So that immediacy to housing and housing resources is limited because we see such a high need of people experiencing homelessness and a limited supply of housing stock. But the principle is for people to have immediate access to housing. To address their homelessness, we're going to be able to work on any other issue more effectively and with greater success if we start with the housing, that everyone's ready for housing, and it's really the supports that we wrap around them. The housing has to be a choice for people. It's not an institutional type of housing. That housing is really a choice, and you need self-determination. We all have that opportunity to choose where we live and who we live with, and many times. So it's rooted in that personal choice. The other piece that most people don't talk about is it's rooted in a recovery orientation approach. That if we're addressing health issues, mental health, behavioral health, substance use, isolation, any kind of other health issues, housing first is really rooted in a recovery orientation. But that recovery is in a path that the person is determining where they're going to start and the level of support. So it's not institutionalized care. The other important piece is that they need social and community integration. And we don't talk about that enough. It's really about getting someone into housing, having the wraparound supports and services that will help them stabilize, and then connecting them to community, whether that's employment, whether that is with, if I have a senior, with the senior community, with employment, whether it's volunteer work. It's really important that they're also connected to social and community integration. Those are the 5 principles of housing first. Housing first without any preconditions, choice and self-determination, recovery oriented, having individual driven supports, and then social and community integration. Most of the conversation now around housing first is the argument that because we're seeing more people experiencing homelessness, housing first doesn't work. The truth is, we are seeing historic amounts of people experiencing homelessness. In fact, we put out a report every month that shows the number of newly homeless and the number housed in the San Diego region, so the entire county. And when we do that annually, we have seen that for every 10 individuals that are housed and in their homelessness, 16 more are experiencing homelessness for the very first time. It's not a failing of our housing approaches. It's really a challenge of a greater need than the system has the resources to address. Not just our housing, but our emergency shelter supports, our social supports, our behavioral health, our clinical space. The needs of a homeless population have far outpaced what we have in our communities to really address their needs. We know that housing ends homelessness. And I'll just give you some really high level information. In the last month in May in San Diego County, we saw over 1,065 people in their homelessness and be housed. That doesn't mean they were housed in permanent supportive housing. Many returned to family or friends or in rapid rehousing, so that's a short-term rental assistance. And only about 10% of those go into permanent supportive housing, which is really the housing with a voucher and those wraparound services. Many people touch the homeless system and just need some navigation and some help and some support to get back to where they're able to achieve housing. But in that same month, we had 1,324 individuals experience homelessness for the very first time. So the system and the investments are working, but the demand on the system is far greater than what we're able to serve. And so when people say, you know, housing first doesn't work because look, we put all this money into it and we're still seeing people experiencing homelessness, I completely agree. We are seeing more and more people needing the services and the support that the system provides. That doesn't mean that the supports that are offered do not work. It actually means that we've got a greater demand and we have a limited housing stock that people are able to afford. Our largest growing population is our 55 or older population. If they are not a homeowner and they are renting, they're at high risk as their rent increase as they get older, especially if they're on fixed incomes, to be completely priced out or to have one traumatic life experience, a loss of spouse, a loss of a job, health conditions that make their housing unstable. So it's also important when we're talking about housing first that we recognize this is a housing approach for people of all ages and all needs. I think we too often associate that only with people who are seen as those who are struggling the most, who have been homeless for a significant period of time, experiencing what we call chronic homelessness. And their experience and coping has really put them in a place where they're either mental health, behavioral health, or substance use has become so disabling that they need a clinical and higher level of care, which is our permanent supportive housing. And so we know that the things that we've invested in work. We also know that we don't have it at the scope and scale that we need. And that's why so much discussion today is really around getting adequate housing, being able to build housing in communities. And we also now need the level of emergency and basic response like emergency shelters. So our focus has been really on housing. That's how you end homelessness. But the higher numbers that we're seeing, we also know that we need to meet those basic needs of shelter, food, places to use the restroom, connect to the system, which is a really important space. So Wendy, with that, I've sort of given a high level. I'd love to sort of open it up to a discussion if you guys are ready.
I think that would be great. And I see there is already one question for you from Colleen Cusack. Thank you for being here, Colleen. Did you want to ask it yourself, Colleen?
Sure. Um, Tamara, how does criminalization fit in the picture of housing first?
Oh, Colleen, that's such a great question, right? Because I think the level of concern and frustration that communities are having, they're leaning into criminalization. And I can tell you that nothing about criminalizing someone's experience of not having housing helps to address that need. It actually makes it harder. If they end up with being arrested, having a record, and I'm trying to get them into housing, right? We're looking at how they take care of that, how it can affect their ability to qualify for housing. And the biggest challenge with criminalization is not only does it not end their homelessness, many times it separates them from the connection to the system and many other things like their personal documents, right? If you were to lose your identity, any proof of income, let's say you're getting Social Security, none of us would be able to rent or be able to do a lease. We've got to have all that documentation. So criminalization not only hurts, I think, the system, but it moves people from where they're connected to the system. It potentially disconnects them from their own personal documents. And that record that is created ends up actually being a barrier for housing. And the other thing that most people don't realize is when people are arrested for and cited for a homeless experience, many of those are never carried through the system. They're usually dismissed. But many times if they're given a ticket and they don't know how to resolve it, it can actually become a warrant later and can become a much bigger problem. So everything about criminalization for someone who doesn't have a home actually complicates the process. It reduces the trust of people in the community that we're trying to connect them to services and actually makes it 10 times harder for them and the system to address really a housing need.
Thank you for that. One follow-up. Do we jeopardize our competitive HUD funding when we criminalize?
Yeah, Colleen, that is really an important piece. We also jeopardize the potential of our state funding if we want to push against housing first. So on the HUD funding, which comes through a continuum of care, we're the lead agency, which we bring about 38 million in HUD dollars, and there's another 25% match. So it's about $45 million, almost all of it being housing. It is written into the language that we are advocating for reducing criminalization, and that if communities are passing ordinances or criminalizing homelessness, we literally have to put it in our report and documentation back each year when we're applying for funding. So it not only makes us less competitive for new funding, but it potentially can put some of the funding we currently have at risk, which it's important to remember that this is, most of it is housing dollars. The other one, Colleen, that you didn't ask about, but I think is important, is we have some of our jurisdictions and some of our electeds saying that they are no longer wanting to be a housing first community. State funding for housing requires that cities be a housing first community. So we've got to be really careful when we're leaning into, I think, knee-jerk reactions or changing language like around housing first, because we may actually be limiting our access to resources that come from all of us as taxpayers. We're paying into it we should be able to have the maximum investment in our communities to really address homelessness.
Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you.
Nancy. Oh, unmute.
No, right.
There you go.
Hi, thank you for your involvement in this issue. I live downtown San Diego, and there's so much mental illness slash drug induced psychosis, and I see it all the time where I walk, where I live, and I'm wondering how you address that. I'm a psychiatrist. I would like to know how to help. But it's just there's a lot of that, and I don't know if if many of those individuals would be able to be in a recovery model. I don't know how to start with that.
Oh, Nancy, it's such a good question. I also live downtown. I think it's important in the work that I do that you live in the core of where you see the greatest challenges. So I've always lived, as I've done this work in San Diego, same thing in Seattle, and the state of Utah, lived right downtown Seattle and in Salt Lake. So Nancy, this is my neighborhood as well, and the streets that I walk and visit. And I think one of the greatest challenges is that we do not have enough spaces for people to be who have persistent mental health issues, behavioral health issues, substance use. Even when people ask for treatment, I don't know if any of you have been in that space, very hard to get someone into a treatment program. So having adequate spaces where we can shelter folks with the higher level of care is really the start of that, right? It's not pushing them out to outside our communities, but it's having adequate places for them to be. We know that the county has a number of open clinical positions. We know that we don't have enough PERT clinicians. They have really struggled to fill those positions. And PERT clinicians are the ones that are really on the street and engaging with that population. I think what we see is where our system is overprescribed, and we don't have enough beds. We don't have enough clinical, we don't have enough recuperative care. I mean, as you've been out there and seen people who are using walkers on the street, right, that are having mobility issues. I think one of the things that we can really advocate for is many more opportunities for people to be able to walk in and get kind of the clinical care, to connect to the supports that they need in the community, and to be able to support some of our community partners like NAMI, their clubhouses, having more spaces where people can connect, and also having more places. Our permanent supportive housing is almost all for serious mental illness, and we struggle to be able to get enough of those in our communities as well. The most important piece is the longer that people are experiencing homelessness, the more profound really their behavioral health, their mental health issues are, and the use of substance becomes. So the faster that we can really address those and have more places for people to be, the more you'll see that reduce. And that is true in communities across the nation. And it's still a challenge for us. What is positive is San Diego, for the primary cities in California, has the largest percentage of shelter numbers for our homeless population. So we've almost got about 50% of our homeless population sheltered versus another 50% unsheltered. But it is just I think the greater need that we see. And if you live downtown as I do, where do we recommend that they go, right? You've got NAMI's Clubhouse, which is small, and I think you have some other providers, but I think that's one of the big challenges is we don't have enough out on the street to connect with them and to provide additional spaces.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think you need doctors on the street, because
Yeah.
I don't think that they're necessarily, some people who I've seen, individuals, may not be able to go somewhere. They're
Right.
too occupied. Do you
Well,
have
and
a
yeah.
doctor?
Yeah, we've got street-based medicine. A lot of our managed care plans are really leaning into that. I don't know if you've seen Kaiser's van out there, San Isidro Health, but I think it's the level of just profound need, just the heartbreaking amount of need that we're seeing. But also important to know that we've really been leaning into more street-based medicine for that very reason, right? Being able to assess someone where they're at, because they're not going to walk into somewhere, but also being able to recommend a place for people to go before they get to that higher level is really important as well. McAllister's another great one. They've got a new space. It's not downtown, but it's up on Market Street that we're really trying to help people know. The other thing is the ability to transport folks. Most people don't realize there's a huge liability in putting someone in a vehicle and transporting them. So we do need that higher level. Many of our outreach teams can't do that. And that's something we've been trying to lean into, because you need to either treat them on the street or be able to transport them to a place of care.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, so we have 3 more questions. We'll probably wrap it up after that. RW, Bonnie, and then Becky. And RW had a question I had too, which is about the mayor's 1,000-person shelter and what you see as any possible pluses or minuses on that.
So to be frank, I haven't had a chance to tour that location, and I recognize that we need more shelter beds in our region. We know that. I think it will depend on starting with what is the population or need that would be sheltered in something that large. And I think the city really is trying to navigate that space incredibly well. I have had some people ask us, is it a fair comparison to what we did during the pandemic at the convention center? And I'll just say the convention center wasn't one singular shelter. We brought in 3 distinct shelters under the convention center, with public health there, with an incident command structure, with significant level of support, because we had a lot of city and county employees who we had Parks and Rec, we had librarians, we had folks in transportation that really wrapped around and offered a level of support that was done at the convention center. So large sheltering models can be very, very challenging because of the profound needs that you see in the population. So my word of caution is, one, we shouldn't be calling anything a warehouse. We don't warehouse people. So if this space is something we're using, let's talk about it the right way. Second, we need to be very mindful when we're talking about people. What are the needs in the community, and what does an appropriate sheltering model look like? Not so much a number, but an approach to sheltering people that is to connect them with housing and the health supports that they need.
Thanks. And Bonnie, you had a question. Unmute. Okay, we still can't hear you. Can you unmute?
Okay. Hi. As someone who has fought City Hall when our landlord suddenly raised our senior affordable housing complexes rent by 50 to 60%, where many of us, well, we just didn't have that money. Or if, we had like $45 left for everything else after we paid our rent with what we get as seniors. Actually, Monica Montgomery was a great help to us in her office, by the way. But one of our issues was the fact that HUD, who we had meetings with, had no sort of program you either got your Section 8 where they paid a whole bunch of rent, but it never had a program to help people stay in housing they've had for years until a landlord did something like that. It was a very scary time for us, but I don't know why there are not programs for people who are stable. I understand the mental problems, and once you're on the street, they only get worse. But they don't seem to have programs just to help people a little bit to stay in the housing they already have if their landlord decides to double their rent suddenly.
Well, Bonnie, first of all, I'm so sorry that happened, because what you're talking about is the leading reason that we're seeing folks that are 55 or older experiencing homelessness, right? So many of them work their entire lives, have, fixed incomes, other things, and you're now paying nearly, 90% of your income towards housing. Now that is an impossible formula, first of all. Second of all, it's also why we've worked so closely. I don't know if you're familiar with Serving Seniors, but Paul Downing, who's on our COC board, we started really leaning into this a number of years ago because, to your very point, there's not a lot of prevention dollars, and there's just not a lot of assistance when you are on an income that is established on a national level, but you live in a community where the basic housing costs are well above those national averages, right? So Social Security and other things aren't based on cost of living in your community. It's a national threshold. And so the challenges really are, and that rents can raise if they're of a smaller subset, older housing stock. We have no rent controls. And so I think you experienced, I think, one of the most scary and unfortunate things that we're seeing today. So with Paul Downing and Serving Seniors, and we did some research, we found that a lot of them said, $300-400 would have kept me in housing. So we really have advocated for shallow subsidies, which is a prevention model for an aging population. There's 2 pilots, one at the city through the Housing Commission, one at the county as well. There is also shallow subsidies as a proven model that has happened for veteran families. It's called SSVF. So you're right, Bonnie, we're starting to lean into, right, the importance of sometimes people just need a little bit of assistance. One of the big challenges that we're finding, though, is if you're on any kind of supports, if that money goes directly to the individual, it may make your income be just above getting the supports that you need, right? So we got to be really careful, and that's why the help of rent and paying rent directly to landlords is an important model. And I'll also say I do a lot of advocacy both at a state and a national level, and we've really been leaning into, if we want to reduce homelessness in this nation, we've got to turn off the spigot. People experiencing homelessness coming in has to be a priority. And a lot of that is just keeping people in their rental units. And that may mean subsidizing rent. Not a full Section 8, right? But just some rent to keep up with those pieces, because Section 8 also requires a whole lot more of the individual receiving it versus just being priced out of the rental market.
May I say something? I think the Housing Commission in San Diego, the reason they're starting that program is because of us. Because we had meetings with them, we talked to them, we were always on them. They eventually, because they had a little glitch and allowed our landlord to do that, they said, okay. And so they ended up giving us each $250 a month to make up the difference, which was all we were asking for. Now, if anyone moves into our little affordable place, it's $1,500 a month, more than $1,500 a month for one person. And I couldn't afford to live here. And it's only because we sued the city, we sued our landlords, and went after the Housing Commission, that we are still here, the ones that are left.
I'm incredibly proud of the courage it takes to really do that, right? Like that is a critical space. And you have, if anyone wants to understand why people experience homelessness, this is why, right? We have housing that is just beyond most people. $1,500, like, anymore, it takes more than one income to afford any level of housing in San Diego. And I think that is also one of the places we really need to focus on, is if you don't have 2 incomes coming in, how do we support folks and really help them stay in their housing?
And how do we create laws that stop landlords, and big corporations from buying up housing and then keeping it sequestered so rents are higher because there's not enough housing? And I feel like they don't go after the people they should go after, which is
well, yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head. And I think, Wendy, one of the things that was in the question is what can you all do? Advocating for housing, housing that's affordable. Our communities only thrive if people can stay in their communities, have their families stay, have your grandchildren close, right? Be really connected. We need diverse housing in all of our communities, that there is a little bit of everything in every community for every income level.
Mhm.
And if we could do that, right, we would reduce the number of folks experiencing homelessness. Also important to remember, the majority of people have mental health, behavioral health, or substance use issues, whether legal or illegal, are housed, right? It is still a small subset of our population. We, though, I think, are losing that sense of urgency and clear direction, right? That this is really a housing issue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. And for our last question, Becky?
Hi. Yes, I actually live in Chula Vista, but I noticed something on the news recently and it's something I've always wondered about when I've seen them go by homeless encampments, and they are picking up, throwing stuff into the trash. And it's always bothered me because I thought, well, there's people's medicines, there's their paperwork and so forth. And sure enough, they mentioned that they're going to try to do something about changing the rules as far as, they go through and they do this when, without giving any warning. And the people may be, out doing something else or something. And I was wondering, do you know anything about this? Are they actually going to do something about this and so forth? Because, people's birth certificates, their paperwork, their, social security cards, and actually, prescriptions and so forth that they need are being thrown away. That's their personal stuff. And I don't care if they're homeless or not. That would be like, going in and taking your guts out and throwing it away. They need to do something about that. And, I don't care which city you're living in. And what can we do to make sure that they're doing that in every city?
Yeah, Becky, I think, it's an important piece to recognize. You're right. Throwing away people's belongings many times includes all of their personal documentation, pictures, right? Like, I would just think about if you were to lose all of your personal information. There are and have been some laws in San Diego that protected that it needed to be posted so that people know that there are practices around being able to go through that information and recognize what are personal documents. I think the challenge that we see is many times, that is not happening. So if you are in a community that doesn't have those kind of protections, or expectations as they are baiting encampments, or anyone who is, in an unsheltered situation, we highly advocate for that being a process, that it is clear and transparent, that it is posted information, that we recognize that many of this information is critical. It's critical to them. As you said, many people, if you have medication, if you have other things, if you were to lose your wallet, right? Like we need to recognize that also people are not just staying in that one spot. They're working hard to end their homelessness. They're trying to meet with the case manager. They have to be at the county's office, right? They have to be at a federally qualified health center, like, family health centers. That, there's a challenge of hauling all their stuff around too. So
Some of them are trying to hold down jobs, and
many of them
taking
work,
to
right?
doctors or something, or putting them in school. But to me, that's the individual, on your list.
Yeah, and I think I know Colleen's not presenting, but she's a brilliant one who can tell you like where the laws all are. And I know that Colleen, there's also a suit that's been started with the county and the county space. So that's another good one to watch.
Okay. So I should
Right.
city at Chula Vista and find out what they have done and what they could do. Okay.
San Diego, what they're allowed to do and what they actually do are two different things. And so right after the ordinance was passed and they wanted to show that there was success from this ordinance, they just started taking people's properties right in front of them, everything they own. Because if you see people walking around town without property, you think that they're not homeless people. So I know that service providers spend 50% of their time just replacing those IDs. And so that's interfering with their ability to do their other job. We're paying one city employee, police, a lot of money to mess up the jobs of other city employees. So it seems like a lot of waste.
Yeah. And the police really don't want to do that, and neither do the trash companies. You know, they're just being told to do that. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
So, by the way, tangent, but for those of you, our next meeting in July, we'll be hearing from a few local candidates, including Colleen, and so you'll get to hear a lot more from her. And I've been following her for a number of years and all the advocacy work she's done on behalf of homeless people and affordable housing. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you next month, Colleen. And I know there's probably a lot more questions, but we have to let Tamera go and we have to get to writing letters and postcards. But I did want to just ask, I know you're going to provide some links and some follow-up information, and I will share that with everyone in our group. But if you have any parting words just on what we as citizens can be doing to support Housing First, to support, justice and decency for homeless people, showing up at city council meetings.
Yeah, Wendy, I think that is the most important thing. Showing up at all city council meetings, right? Not just the city of San Diego, but all of our cities are having conversations about this. And I think we hear from people who have very strong opinions about, and it's actually not about the conditions that people are in having nowhere to be housed, but a judgment about the people who are experiencing that. And they're, it's become rather vile in a lot of ways. And so being able to hear from others in the community that we want thriving communities, we want places where people can be, we want to treat each other with dignity, and that we recognize that there's a lot of challenges out there. We know that there's challenges of health, there are challenges, and that what we really want to see is a place where people can safely be, where they can be connected to the health and the housing that they need, and that we all need to be advocating that this is a place where we can all afford to live, and that we can all afford to get the supports that we need in our community. So being Housing First is really just saying we believe that anyone can thrive in housing. It also means that we know we need more housing, and we also need to be willing to have all types of housing in all of our communities. So advocate for that. Be vocal in your communities. Every voice matters. Too often, I think we get the people who are really angry and frustrated, and not so much hear from the people in the community who want us to do better by just doing better and treating each other better, and really showing up and saying, you know what, I'm happy to have more housing in my community that meets the affordability at all levels, so that we all can thrive and we can love the San Diego the way that we do, and that and we care for those who need us to see them and meet their needs.
Well, there are heroes out there doing this wonderful work, and you're certainly one of them. And we're really honored to have you join us today, Tamera. And thank you so much for your work. And we'll keep people posted on what they can do to help. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Have a great Saturday. I'm just so grateful you wanted to talk about it on a Saturday. That means an awful lot to me as well. So I'll leave you be. Thank you.
Take care. Okay. That was really good. And I always send a follow-up email a few days after the meeting, and that will include some of the information that Tamera is going to supply.